This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. Economics, when boiled right down to it, is really nothing more than an attempt to most efficiently allocate your scarce resources. In the end, every economic decision pretty much boils down to that. But even with that phrase locked in your head, I think a lot of people still think of decisions in economic policy making as, should I give this project money or should I give this project money? In reality though, as a government, you're probably already giving money to both. And the decision the economist needs to make is whether to reallocate funds from one to the other, as the other one might be running more efficiently. What it's important to remember is that most decisions aren't on and off, but instead a sliding scale. As an example of what I'm talking about here, if I gave you the job of being in charge of all tourism within the United States, and then I magically came to you with $100 million to spend on tourism promotions for California, that on the surface sounds great. That would encourage more tourists to come to California, which means more money, more foreign currency reserve. Seems like a no-brainer. But here's where the economics gets complicated. Because whilst, yes, California's tourism does go up, Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona's tourism just went down. As international visitors who'd planned on visiting Oregon have seen your ad and they choose to go to California instead. Or families that were planning to holiday in their own state are now choosing California instead. That $100 million, even though it may have come from nowhere, may have been helping one state. By doing so, it's hurting three. As an economist, you know that building a bridge is great, but by building that bridge, you're also killing the local ferry industry. Building a port closer to the city is great, but you're also cutting the truck drivers' wages in that city in half, as they now only need to travel half the distance. This is just a taste of the kind of balancing acts economists have to deal with, but there is no more contentious balancing act than I can think of for an economist than the one currently unfolding inside China. The People's Republic of China, a nation that, whether you're talking about government surveillance or environmental protections, could be regarded as some by the most communist, but could be regarded by others as the most capitalist. And this country, this nation of contradictions, is currently seeing its financial base stones begin to form cracks. Most of these events seem small for now, but a lot of these act as the canary in the coal mine for worse things to come. Already we're seeing several banks across the country going bankrupt and taking people's life savings with them. We're seeing the formation of a $10 trillion real estate bubble, and Chinese firms that were once in the top 10 real estate firms in the world go from economic juggernauts to bankrupt within 90 days. We're seeing local governments in an arms race to build the flashiest infrastructure, only to sweep the debt attached to it under the rug for the next guy to deal with, once they've taken the praise and been promoted upstairs. And we're seeing Xi faced with the decision to keep his foreign policy guys and keep his currency weak, therefore increasing exports and keeping the world reliant on Chinese goods, whilst having his economic advisors tell him that he should strengthen his currency and improve his own people's standard of living, whilst knowing that by doing so, he's almost guaranteeing that the factories that made China the engine of the world that it is today will almost immediately start fleeing to India, Vietnam, or Indonesia. Xi Jinping is currently standing over and staring at the economic sliders of the world's second largest economy, knowing that a nudge left or a nudge right might fix the entire country and usher in a new period of dynamic growth within China, or if he nudges it in the wrong direction, may bring down an ever heavier house of cards upon him. So what options does Xi have at the moment? How serious are these economic signals? How did China get into this predicament? And how healthy would we regard Beijing's finances under the surface? Well, to answer all of that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Broke, breaking, or burgeoning.
It's a pet peeve of mine that people repeat the phrase that the Chinese Communist Party lifted millions out of poverty. I think a lot of the economic miracle that we have seen in more recent decades, where we've seen double-digit growth year after year, a lot of that I think we should better attribute to the government lifted a lot of these controls, how business, manufacturing, becoming kind of like the engine of the world, partially ascribed to government policies, but a lot of it, I think it's just the eagerness of the Chinese people to emerge from this dark, chaotic period of revolution.
Joanna Chiu is the senior reporter covering national and foreign stories for the Toronto Star and the author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder. As a globally recognized authority on China, Chiu is a regular commentator of international broadcast media. She's also previously based in Beijing as a foreign correspondent for numerous publications including AFP and the DPA, specializing in coverage of Chinese politics, economy, and legal affairs. She was also formerly based in Hong Kong, reporting for the South China Morning Post and The Economist magazine, as well as the Associated Press. And in addition to all that, she's also the chair of New Voices, an editorial collaborative which celebrates the creative and academic work of women working on the subject of China. And we're thrilled to have her on the program today.
Today, China remains, despite its economic growth, very, very unequal, although it's comparable to the inequality we see in countries like the United States, where a lot of economic growth, it's concentrated in what Chinese call tier one cities, like what basically the cities Westerners, people around the world have heard of, like Beijing, Shanghai. Those are tier one cities, often close to the Eastern Coast, close to connections with the world, trade routes. There you see these cosmopolitan, very modernist skylines of China. Whereas you go kind of more in China's hinterland, it couldn't be more different. Even within those cities, you look at where the migrant workers live. And I've done work with migrant workers living in cities like Beijing, Shanghai. They're basically shanty towns and their life is so precarious. And there's so few resources, including access to healthcare, even kids who can't get a proper education. So there's a lot of inequality in China still. The government might be increasingly aware of it. You may have heard Deng Xiaoping, a former leader, try to reassure the people that some people will get rich first. And many people did get rich first and very rich. And this did not trickle down to the masses. So now we're seeing the Chinese government is trying to use this catchphrase instead, which is common prosperity for all, trying to eradicate poverty. So they are aware of China's inequality problems.
It's impossible to understand how much the Chinese economy has changed over the last 30 years, transforming from a largely agricultural economy to one that now includes large parts of the world's tech, manufacturing, and finance sectors. But how the average Chinese citizen spends their money is also rapidly changing. Just in the space of the last 20 years, whilst consumer spending is up, household debts are also way up as well, climbing from 18% of the total Chinese GDP to 61% of the total Chinese GDP. Meaning the average household in China holds almost as much as 2/3 of the entire Chinese GDP just in household debts. Youth unemployment also skyrocketed over that period, from 4.37% in the early 90s to now being above 19%, almost triple that of the US rate during the peak of the GFC. But the sector that most people are ringing alarm bells about is the housing sector, which became one of the staples of the Chinese economy through a combination of speculation and consolidation. It's amazing to think that an economy that only a few decades ago banned the ownership of private housing is now one of the largest real estate markets on the planet, with real estate in Chinese cities like Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Tianjin becoming some of the most expensive in the entire world, where an average apartment in Shenzhen now costs 61 years of annual Chinese wages to pay off. Whereas when you compare with the US, it's more like 8 to 9 years of using 100% of your wages to pay off a house. As although an expensive US apartment is roughly the same price as an expensive Chinese apartment, Chinese wages are about a sixth of those of the US. All of which we'll be going through in more detail further on in the episode. But for now, I want to address one of the biggest factors that always comes up when discussing things about China: the validity of the figures. It's no secret that China does manipulate some of its international economic figures, but how far off reality are they? How far can they be trusted, and are there other metrics we can use to more accurately measure the Chinese GDP? Because once we understand that, we can actually understand where the Chinese economy is at the moment.
Chinese economic figures are notoriously unreliable from a kind of like a confluence of factors. Some people say that with the nature of the political system being so centralized, with Xi having so much power that the lower level officials, party bosses, they want to impress their superiors, they want to pad their economic data. So even China's top leaders and officials have expressed skepticism about how reliable these figures are. Li Keqiang, the former premier, there was an alternative index named after him, which measured, instead of GDP, things like train cargo volume, electricity consumption, number of bank loans, And other firms in China, financial firms, also try to use different measures to try to gauge economic activity. Things like looking at satellite imagery and seeing factory activity and electricity consumption and things like that. So it's not a secret that economic data isn't very reliable, but there have been some moves to try to make them more reliable. For example, the National Bureau of Statistics is trying to standardize reporting systems so that data is reported directly to Beijing from different sources rather than first going for local government leaders who, again, might be prone to inflate them to gain kind of more political favor and avoid negative political attention. So definitely when you see GDP figures, especially from China, I have to take that with a grain of salt.
And most economists are skeptical of China's figures. But things became even more eyebrow-raising than usual when China simply refused to release its GDP figures earlier on this November. So can you take us through what happened and what the reaction was?
In the last Party Congress in October, when President Xi consolidated his power, got a third term as president, that China actually didn't release its GDP figures as it would normally. And to me, that was really shocking. It did kind of point to the assumption that the economy is doing worse than analysts had predicted. When I was a correspondent in Beijing, I used to have to wake up so early before these congresses and meetings to line up with the other wire reporters to try to get these GDP figures first. It was kind of like hallmark at the beginning of the Congress. So for them to kind of break that tradition and not release the figures, it did raise a lot of eyebrows and generated concern, not just internationally, but domestically too. And surely once they did release the figures, which weren't as bad as economists expected, it was about 4% growth. The Chinese markets reacted and they plunged because people assumed that if it said 4%, actually the reality of economic growth was much lower.
Having spoken and worked with several Chinese bureaucrats over the years, they all tell me there's an underlying problem with the current system. That even if they were honest players, when they come into the job and they do an accurate study of the region's economic health, if they find the previous guy has inflated the books, then the last thing they would want to do is report the truth, because it would make it seem like their sector has massively dropped in economic output. So they either need to build that previous person's fudging of the numbers into their numbers, or have to even build upon it to make themselves seem like they're doing a good job. And this creates a compounding problem from bureaucrat to bureaucrat. I've heard a few stories about this, but how often do you think it's actually happening?
Yeah, there's quite a snowball effect. When I first started reporting in China in 2012, I go to these party meetings and you could actually have some substantive conversations with members of the government, representatives. But the last time I was in China in one of these meetings, everyone told me they had the flu. They had Ganmao and they couldn't talk to me. And that was a line they did to try to avoid reporters. And there's still, I hear from sources, a culture of kind of fear across different levels of government. They don't want to kind of shake things up. They don't want to stand out. Definitely don't want to criticize national policy.
And this problem is often attributed as one of the main reasons we see things going wrong very quickly when it comes to Chinese economics, where companies like Evergrande, one of the largest real estate conglomerates in China, seemed fine, and all of a sudden, they're not. And trillions of yuan are wiped from their value in the space of just days. And after multiple stories like this, and the increasing consolidation of Chinese wealth tied up in the real estate market, there are more and more analysts ringing alarm bells at the moment. And the word bubble is being uttered more and more by specialty Chinese economists. But how did we get here? Why is it that even though most people can see it's an obvious bubble, real estate is still by far the most dominant asset in Chinese people's portfolios, as compared to Western countries, which people might have real estate, but they also might have IRAs or social securities or stocks or bonds? Why is it that China seems to put all its eggs in the one basket?
Yeah, well, this was ingrained even in me growing up in Canada by my parents, that owning real estate is the smartest way to protect your wealth and build your wealth. That it was foolish to use up your credit card and spend on frivolous things. And living in China, I think that was, taking up another notch, many notches that I wasn't previously exposed to being an overseas Chinese. My local friends would show me dating apps where there's different icons where especially men would say whether they had a car, whether they owned a house. And a lot of women would not even bother talking to a man, whatever age, if they didn't own a house. So that's how important things are. But living in a big city like Beijing, I kind of understood where that kind of thinking came from. In 4 years, I had to move 4 times because there's so little rental protections. Really, everything's in favor of landlords, of homeowners. All of society seems to want to push people to own homes. Otherwise, you're really kind of losing the game. You are so precarious. You have to move from place to place. It's not like Europe where renting is a lot more of the norm. Definitely owning a home, whether you're even working class, is something that basically it seems mandatory, especially for men. It's almost a prerequisite if you want to get married, if you want to find a decent partner. And this is coupled with other factors like immaturity and instability of the Chinese stock market, limited opportunities for Chinese to invest abroad because of strict capital controls. I've done some stories where Chinese resorted to using black market banks in order to smuggle their money overseas to do things like buy property overseas in places like London and Sydney and Vancouver. Or else they find other means to kind of protect and park their wealth by buying art, for example. But of course, there's limited opportunities to buy valuable art. So definitely housing is the main way that a lot of Chinese think is the best way to protect and build your wealth.
And compounding that issue is the problem of Chinese government interventions within the Chinese stock market. As many inside the Chinese financial system will tell you, many Chinese stocks are manipulated or influenced by the central government. And because of this, a change of policy or a releasing of updated figures can mean a Chinese stock jumping up or down by quite large percentages within minutes. And really only those inside the party itself know the true value of that stock, meaning that insiders can often buy up stocks at far cheaper than everyone else is aware they're worth, or flood the market with these stocks before an incoming change of policy. And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of criticisms about the Western stock exchanges too, but at very least, they're mostly dictated by market supply and demand, making it much more difficult to manipulate individual stocks. And because of this market manipulation by the Chinese state, people are often hesitant to put lots of money into the Chinese stock market, and instead continue to consolidate and put more money into the Chinese real estate market, as is often seen as one of the only parts of the Chinese market that truly feels free market effects. But taking a deeper look at this, where you put your investment money is a problem that really only affects some people in China, the ones who have the spare cash to invest, which isn't the majority of them. Chinese citizens who are living paycheck to paycheck aren't thinking too much about stock manipulation inside Beijing. So when we do see protests against market manipulation or even bank defaults in the South, from sources it seems to only be the people who are invested that take to the streets to protest this, rather than a true cross-section of society that we'd see protesting something like the COVID lockdowns. How aware do you think the average citizen is of these events going on in other cities around the country?
I have seen some pretty incredible crackdowns when there's any kind of protest in one city that it would immediately disappear. For example, when a Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, he died, he was famous, as a writer, as kind of like a visionary for China's future that was a bit more democratic. When he died in police custody, people tried to do really subtle things on social media to commemorate him, such as by using some candle emojis. Those were completely scrubbed really quickly, using photographs that were flipped and posting them to see if that would get past the censors. So those are all scrubbed. But interestingly, for these protests, perhaps because they were so big and so much of it was recorded on social media, I didn't see this mass censorship. I think having looked at China's censorship systems, they had the ability to completely, mostly censor what was going on and what was being transmitted from the protest, but they chose not to. However, it was pretty short-lived. It didn't go on for days and days and days. Perhaps the government made the decision that there's so much anger and frustration that letting people protest, not cracking down too much on communication about the protest, will give people like a release valve for their anger, and then they can move on with some limited arrests of some more of the prominent people involved in the protests. And it seemed to have largely worked.
As someone who watches China very closely, what are some of the signals and signs that you would look for that the Chinese economy may be faltering under the surface?
It's hard. China's very unpredictable. You think things are going one way and then suddenly they kind of switch and go the other way. Many people did not expect there to be mass protests. Many people did not expect stock markets to suddenly crash at certain moments. And again, a lot of people are reluctant to speak out and, tell the world about these warning signs because they're worried about offending national authorities. So it's hard to get these kind of warning signs. People do, different analytics firms have ways to gauge the strength of the Chinese economy that isn't focused on GDP.
With China and its massive population, it means that every policy tweak will impact millions of people. Even if a policy change only impacts 1% of China's population, that still means it impacts 14.1 million people. That's almost the entire population of the Netherlands if a policy only impacts just 1% of the country. And I know very little policies that impact that little people. And now realizing the impact that policy tweaks have on the wider population, think about the fact that Xi is facing a crisis in the health sector, a real estate bubble, countries divesting from China at record levels, growing tensions with the US, and tech sanctions all at the same time, and realize that he'll have to make drastic policy calls on all of these issues. And that is almost certain to affect, I'd say, a little more than 1% of the population. It's very easy to see how these policy knock-on effects will ripple throughout China. And because of China's place within the global economy, it means that we'll feel the impact as well. So how bad are these problems? How does Xi plan on tackling them? And what impact are they going to have on the wider global economy? But to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Price tags and red flags.
The age of double-digit growth has been over for a long time in China at this stage. And there's obviously a downshift that's occurring for a number of different reasons.
Logan Wright is a partner at the Rhodium Group and leads the firm's China markets research work. In addition to that, Logan is also the adjunct fellow of the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Logan was also the head of the China research for Medley Global Advisors and a China analyst with Stone and McCarthy Research Associates, both based in Beijing. Logan's research predominantly focuses on China's financial system and credit conditions, and in shaping outcomes within China's economy. And based on his decades of research, he's also the author of 2 reports on China's financial system and the country's longer-term economic trajectory, titled Credit and Credibility and the China Economic Risk Matrix. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
You can't really think about the long-term future of China's economy without thinking about the financial system that is going to power that economy. And no matter how you look at China's financial system growth in the last decade or so, it has been unprecedented in global and historical terms. We've seen the largest single country credit expansion relative to global GDP in at least a century. It's simply very difficult to repeat that kind of performance and that kind of growth. And our view is simply that that type of credit growth is not going to continue in the future, as the financial system will need to, in the future, grow at a slower pace than the economy, because a financial system can only expand relative to the size of the economy it's powering, so-called deepening financial services or deepening access to finance for so long before it hits a point of diminishing returns. And we would argue we're well past that point of diminishing returns in China at this stage.
And what sort of signals are you seeing that China's economy is slowing down?
There are headwinds in China's economy specifically that argue for a much more structural slowdown that's underway, one of which, of course, is demographics. The fact is that China's population is, by most accounts, has peaked in 2022. If it hasn't peaked in 2022, it'll peak in 2023. This is far earlier than expectations of where China's population peak was going to be. Even as late as 2020, 2021, people were expecting that the peak in China's population would be in the late 2020s or the early 2030s, instead of materializing virtually right away. That doesn't mean that the labor force can't continue urbanizing, can't continue growing, but you're talking about shifting from a substantial demographic dividend, demographic headwinds, to growth. And, frankly speaking, there are not many examples of large economies in the global economy, those that are among the 20 largest economies in the world, facing declining working age populations for a sustained period of time. The prime example is Japan, and there's many analogies to be drawn from the Japanese experience. But there are very few other cases, and China's working age population has been declining since 2013 to 2015, sometime in that time frame. So the demographic headwinds to continued growth of the labor force and therefore growth of the economy are also, highly significant.
So very quickly, you're going to have more people who are taking from these social safety nets than there are paying into it. And that's a terrifying place to be, as you either need to cut the support to your older populations or take more money from the working populations to keep up the benefits. And by putting more pressure on your working populations, you'll be doing things like increasing the amount of people who are likely to emigrate from the country. But the other big financial imbalance you've done a lot of work on is one coming from the state and provincial governments, and in particular, coming from the LGFVs. Can you take us through what these are and the current predicament unfolding around them?
So for years, China was underinvested. So there was a dramatic shortage of capital accumulation. There were tremendous opportunities for catch-up growth. And the real problems were just trying to incentivize, trying to aggregate capital within the banking system and deploy it for productive uses. And where virtually all investment was productive, this was not really a challenge to drive growth. In the past, Beijing would use the competitive instincts of local officials to drive employment and local and stability within their jurisdictions to drive investment. So you didn't have to do very much to encourage local government investment. You just had to sort of make the credit available through the banking system, and you would get local governments expanding investment very aggressively. This was the process throughout most of the 2000s. And as a result, local governments started being overly enthusiastic about new investments. And then there were new controls put in place to try to limit that exuberance because there was an uptick in inflation, particularly in 2006, 2007. And so you had to put credit quotas on. And all of a sudden, these local governments started running into financial difficulties of their own. After the global financial crisis, the emphasis was on, okay, how can we restore and relax some of these controls over local governments? How can we restore some of these competitive pressures to stimulate investment growth? The problem was that many of these local government companies had too much debt, and so you needed new vehicles, new balance sheets that were clean. There was a tremendous expansion of what are called local government financing vehicles, LGFVs in common parlance, rongzipingtai in Chinese, and all sorts of ways in which these could operate. But basically, there was an equity injection into these firms in the form of land.
So usually Beijing, who collect most of the taxes, would give money to the states. The states worry about state issues, and they might give money down to local councils who might organize things like bin collection. But in times of financial hardship, when Beijing is low on money, they might start sending less money to the states. And therefore, many states would cancel upcoming projects. So when state leaders were looking for a way to make themselves look good to party bosses, hoping to get promoted, they decided to, instead of accepting the loss of money, look elsewhere for it. And this is where they turned to LGFVs, the local government financing vehicles. See, how it would work is most of the land in China belongs to the state governments. The government would then lease this valuable land to the LGFVs, a private company the government would set up, but would on paper not be part of the government. So now the land would be owned by the LGFVs rather than the state government. The LGFVs would then either lease that land off or give it to a bank as collateral so they can take out large bank loans. And now with that extra money, they can now contract out infrastructure projects to the city. And their city keeps building things whilst other cities complained about Beijing not sending enough money. And at the time, these seemed like a win-win-win-win-win. As the city kept building infrastructure even in times of monetary shortages, party bosses liked it because they got to move debt off of the city's books and onto the books of these private companies. So on paper, the city looks like it's in better shape than it is. The banks liked it because they got access to heaps of state land, which in a booming real estate market meant massive profits for the banks. And Beijing liked it because they could see that the states could function on reduced budgets, meaning that the following year, they could divert money away from the states and put it towards national projects like dams, highways, or aircraft carriers. So once these LGFVs became a successful model, how quickly were they rolled out across China?
After the global financial crisis, headline credit grew by over, I think it was 31% in 2009. It then grew by a similar, by almost over 20% in 2010. You had a near doubling of the size of the banking system between 2008 and 2012. There was a tremendous expansion in credit, and local government borrowing was really at the center of this process. The problem, of course, with this is that this was essentially government spending or quasi-government spending, but it was financed through commercial banks. And so this created a huge overhang of debt that was technically corporate debt, but then China had to figure out how to sort of manage the fallout of that debt and how to prevent it from rising exponentially. And that became the preoccupation, and is still, in many ways, a preoccupation of many fiscal authorities over the next decade or so. The problem being, if you cut off these companies, then you have these immediate fiscal costs that you have to be repaid, and you also have a very sharp slowdown in growth. But if you allow it to continue to grow, you just have these huge contingent liabilities within the banking system. And more importantly, you eventually get less bang for your buck, so to speak, because more and more new credit needs to go into repaying the legacy debt from previous years. And that's really the process through which we have seen local government investment in China slow over the past 5 years in particular, because the debt burden is so large that you continue pouring new credit into local government financing vehicles, into the local government coffers in general. A significant proportion, somewhere between 20 and 25%, typically goes toward refinancing of old debt. There is less money for new spending. So you keep expanding the credit, the financial system, but it generates less and less growth. This has been the dynamic that we've seen in China, especially over the last 5 years. And it's one reason that you simply can't see the same drivers of the economy continue into the future as they have in the recent past.
So as I said, this was a win-win-win-win-win at the time. But as these LGFVs kept taking more and more loans from the government to keep spending more on infrastructure to compete with the other states, the banks' interest rates also went up. But the infrastructure kept coming and the banks kept making more money. And at this point, Beijing would start sending less money to the states, seeing that the states were practically taking care of themselves. And with less federal money coming into the states, it means that the states effectively have to double down on the program, having to continuously make up the shortfalls that the federal government's leaving in their coffers. And this caused an exponential problem. But everything was fine, as long as the real estate market stays solid, as the price people would pay for land was still really high, maintaining the bank's demand for more land from the local governments. As with the real estate market continuously climbing, there was always more demand from the banks for extra land, so the money tap stayed on. And this is where the bubble began to inflate. States began to compete with each other for infrastructure spending, so they kept asking for loans, and land kept being given to the banks, and the banks would keep selling it faster than people could buy. And seeing the value go up, more and more Chinese citizens put all of their life savings into these homes. After all, it's safer than the Chinese stock market, and a lot of people can't get their money overseas. And with more people chucking their entire life savings into homes, it pushes the price up even further, pushing the banks to demand even more land from the local governments in order to meet the demand for land from the Chinese citizens. And this cycle kept spiraling up and up and up and up until we reach a point where there's lots of infrastructure, but all these LGFVs are in a crazy amount of debt. The price of housing has just become absurd, and the state have pretty much thrown every good bit of real estate into the system. And with the real estate market so profitable, this is the point where speculators really get into the market, buying up multiple housing packages, many for houses that weren't even built yet, just knowing that at the time the credit was available, so they could take out huge loans for a house that didn't even exist, because hey, housing only goes up. There were so many houses purchased in this period of time that in addition to the people buying the houses, there will be enough empty spare homes to house 90 million people. That's the entire population of Germany. But because of the real estate speculation, demand kept outstripping the supply in certain areas, causing apartments in certain cities like Shenzhen to be worth $800,000, whilst at the exact same time in other cities far off in the country, entire ghost towns popped up, where there'd be rows and rows of tower blocks that would just lay empty. Built, ready to live in, but no one would live there. But again, that didn't matter to the speculators, because housing prices only ever go up, right? And the speculators know that eventually someone will buy it from them, even if it's just another speculative investment. And a lot of these houses were bought as speculative investments, almost like poker chips to be traded or sold. The aim wasn't to live in the house, it was to be used as a store of value. And for a lot of investors, all they possessed was a piece of paper that was worth 60 years of Chinese wages. At this point in the story, Goldman Sachs would estimate that the LGFVs would be worth $8 trillion US. Again, a frankly absurd number. And now we move forward in the story and come to July 2019, where so many houses are being demanded and being pre-sold that only 60% of China's houses, even the ones bought back in 2013, were actually built. 40% of these houses and speculative properties are just a piece of paper with a promise to eventually build the owner a house, as long as that construction company, doesn't go under or run off with your money. Then 2020 hit. The pandemic began, and China went into some of the world's harshest lockdowns. People lost their jobs and income, and in the space of just a few months, sales of houses dropped by 25%. Construction dropped by 40%, and land purchases dropped by a whopping 50%. And with this massive downturn, many of these construction companies skipped town with the investors' money or simply went bankrupt, further shaking confidence in the real estate market. And as a result, the demand for land from the LGFVs dried up quickly. And we reached a point where the local governments have no one buying the land, whilst their interest payments are sky high. And people with no income and no social safety net are defaulting en masse. All happening in the middle of a pandemic recession, a time when most governments would usually want to ramp up their infrastructure spending in order to keep everybody employed. So at this point, what does the federal government do? Either they let these states and their LGFVs go under, taking everybody's house and therefore retirement and life savings with them, or spend massive amounts of federal money to bail out these states at the expense of military, healthcare, and infrastructure spending by the national government. So what options do Beijing have, and what do they do?
So basically, local governments are responsible for more and more social services, more and more spending liabilities and obligations relative to their sources of revenue. And in order to supplement those revenues, local governments have relied very heavily upon land sales in the recent past, which has helped them to sort of keep up with their own ambitions in terms of funding investment, and at the same time as fulfilling some of the fiscal and quasi-fiscal obligations they have. So ultimately, there have been many attempts to try to resolve this imbalance, to try to give local governments more revenue responsibilities and revenue sources to repay those rising expenditure obligations. But those have all been, very half-hearted and unsuccessful so far. And so you have this ambiguity when it comes to central government obligations to local governments. Beijing basically wants to keep it ambiguous in terms of how much support they will provide for local government fiscal conditions. The Ministry of Finance comes out and says, we're going to restructure all local government implicit and explicit debt. Then the likely response would be to encourage additional borrowing at the local government level, because that would all be guaranteed. If instead the Ministry of Finance says, as they often do, local governments need to control this debt on their own, then that slows the economy substantially, because localities need to pay down credit, they need to reduce borrowing, they need to reduce investment. And that's historically been associated with meaningful slowdowns in the economy, such as what happened when there was pressure on local government debt amidst the broader deleveraging campaign in 2018. So this is this ambiguity that needs to be resolved. Ultimately, there need to be more sources of tax revenue. Ultimately, this probably means higher taxes in China on someone. It's a question of just how that is distributed. And this is why a property tax has been long rumored, long expected, because it's sort of an ideal source of revenue that can accrue to local governments, does deliver a blow against the property market and limit speculation in the property market by potentially instilling carrying costs on speculative property purchases. But every time that a property tax looks closer and closer to adoption, it becomes more difficult to muster the appropriate political will to deploy this, precisely because that's typically when the property sector is under pressure and you want to continue to rely upon property construction as a source of growth. That's no longer really a possibility, because in many ways, peak property demand was probably reached on a fundamental level in 2013 to 2015 when China's working age population and household formation rates also peaked. What we're looking at right now is a situation where housing has been overbuilt relative to fundamental demand for about 7 or 8 years. Particularly, new starts hit an all-time record in 2020, 2021, even as household formation rates, marriage rates, other indicators of housing demand were plummeting. But the point is that the market basically was supported by speculators and investors. And if those speculators and investors are no longer part of the demand mix going forward, then the overall pace of construction needs to slow significantly.
But that doesn't solve the complete issue. Another problem is that even if you can slow down speculation and construction growth and bring down the demand in these rural cities, you won't slow down speculation and demand in the tier 1 cities like Shanghai, Beijing, or Guangzhou, as the Chinese have a system called the Hukou system, which, oversimplifying here, pretty much means that government services are given to the direct area's residents. In practice, what it means is the best state schools and universities quite often only give loans and take students from people who live directly in that city. So families become desperate to buy an address in these tier 1 cities to try and get access to the better schools, jobs, benefits, and privileges offered to people with addresses in these cities. So even if the government managed to clamp down on rural speculation, how do they solve the major city speculation without doing away with the entire Hukou system?
Correct. I mean, you've described the situation accurately. There's a large inventory of houses in interior provinces and third, fourth tier cities that probably isn't going to be digested under any price assumptions, that it's probably going to stay unoccupied because it's been overbuilt, and many of those smaller cities are already losing population, already seeing outmigration, and you're not likely to see investment-driven demand come in. At the same time, in coastal cities, in more developed areas in coastal provinces, demographically, you're still seeing a rise in population. You have low inventories of housing. You have the potential for prices to still rise. Now, from a construction perspective, from a growth perspective, those are smaller than the aggregate construction that's taken place in the interior. And then you have this political problem, essentially, which is the reliance upon pre-construction sales for the overall housing market. And so you have many developers who have basically promised to deliver houses, but are now losing the sales revenues that would allow them to complete those houses. And that is a huge political problem for Beijing with this overhang in the market. Key point is that looking into the future, where is housing demand going to come from? We would estimate that there's roughly around 550 to 750 million square meters of sustained housing demand on an annual basis going forward. The problem is that that's around half of the size of what the market was in 2020 to 2021. So if that sustainable level is around half of its current size and the property sector is around a quarter of the economy, it's obvious that that's going to have a significant economic impact.
So Beijing knows it has to pull the lever at some point, but when it does, it will cause huge economic damage throughout the Chinese economy, which makes the decision really hard because at the moment, China is desperate not to spook international investors by rolling out these crackdowns, as Beijing is more than aware that many companies devolved their supply chains away from China during the pandemic. But now with the country reopening, countries are deciding whether to go back to China or stay where they are. So China can see this property time bomb ticking away, but at the same time doesn't want to trigger a financial crisis whilst people are in the middle of making a decision whether to come back to China or not. How is China going to try and get international investors to re-establish their supply chains within China?
This is a real tension as well. I mean, there's no way to look at the Chinese economy and conclude that the international environment is friendlier at this point toward China's external economic engagement than it was 2 decades ago. There are considerably more obstacles, exactly as you cite, to continued trading patterns, the consistent weaponization of trade-related channels in Beijing in terms of retaliation against foreign actions that they find unpalatable. That's been a part of this process. All of the COVID-related restrictions that have just been put in place that have hampered multinationals' access to certain key parts of their supply chain. So I would expect an effort to try to calm some of those tensions down, to try to reassure foreign multinational corporates to try to reassure foreign countries that China is again sort of open for business. But there's this tension in terms of how you try to stabilize domestic conditions, not only in trade, but in capital flows. And so it is a very fine line they have to walk in terms of what kind of pressure can you put on foreign trade and capital flows to try to maximize China's own leverage, and what impact will that have on the credibility of China as a financial market, which can potentially have implications for the exchange rate in the future, the influence of China in the international economy in the future as well.
Let's take a quick look away from real estate and look at some of the projects these LGFVs threw money at, as some of them were quite wise, but others were not. There are projects like rural railways in particular that required huge loans to build, but have so few passengers that they barely cover the operating cost of the rail line, let alone the maintenance cost or the eye-watering amounts of interest they have to pay on the loans they took out to build the railway in the first place. So projects like this will just keep losing the local government's money year after year. These were projects that the government was looking at because they needed something to invest into, and all of the obvious projects have pretty much already been built. So if we're getting to that point already, are we hitting a point of diminishing return on some of these Chinese infrastructure projects? And China's run out of these highways they can build that can open up entire cities and make 100 times their investment, and we're now into projects that actually lose China money.
No, that's right. And that's sort of speaking to this broader question of some of the factors that have driven China's economic growth over the last decade just simply aren't going to be repeated in the next decade. And infrastructure is definitely one of them. Not only because of the factors I was talking about, where more and more new credit is being used to repay old debt, and so therefore you have less efficient credit growth in terms of actually powering new investment, but there's areas where infrastructure could definitely improve. There's areas where you could still generate, marginal positive returns, but what kind of financial system is going to fund those, and what local governments are going to be in position to leverage up after you've already seen a financial system expand so much faster than the real economy over the previous decade. And that's kind of the conundrum that China is facing. So there's expectations that the economy will rebound in 2023 based on policy support from authorities, but that policy support cannot necessarily translate into stronger credit growth, where there is a significant weakness in credit demand from both households and corporates, where there's risk aversion that is taking place among lenders into all of a sudden there are risks in the property sector that you hadn't anticipated before. All of a sudden there are risks in lending to local state-owned corporates where they've been defaulting on their bonds. All of a sudden there are risks in lending to LGFVs because those haven't defaulted on corporate bonds yet, but they're starting to default on loans. And there was a restructuring of a city in Guizhou, Zunyi, recently, where loan proceeds were basically reportedly extended for 20 years, where the local government financing vehicle didn't need to repay the loan for over 20 years. No one's going to want to lend aggressively in that environment, even to government-preferred projects. And so you're just not going to have the same sort of impulse of policy support as you've had before. And it also means that Beijing is simply less in control of the key drivers of the economy. If you can't really control monetary policy and fiscal policy is constrained by the debt levels that are limiting the expansion of local government investment, then there are simply fewer tools you've got to control economic momentum, and you have to rely upon more conventional tools like trying to prop up consumption, either with consumption vouchers, consumption coupons, in some respect, or subsidy programs in other ways. Tax cuts, but those are difficult because China doesn't charge very much in individual income tax. And this is just sort of part of the same theme that regardless of how you think about the future of the Chinese economy, it's not going to look like it has in the recent past. This is the pandemic is part of that meaningful break with the previous patterns of growth, but it's not the only reason for it. We were already in the midst of a pretty dramatic adjustment in the overall pace of credit growth, and therefore we were facing a structural slowdown even before the COVID outbreak occurred.
And this debt is already having real effects, as even some of the banks are now far too over-leveraged with loans, with more and more small banks being unable to refinance their debt. So we're seeing more and more rural and agricultural banks in China going bankrupt, shutting down and taking people's life savings with them. So when these smaller banks do go bankrupt, can you tell us what effect this has for the local economy and why this seems to be happening more and more often?
Basically, ever since Baoshang Bank collapsed in 2019, in May 2019, you saw several other banks need restructuring or immediate liquidity support. There's many reasons for this, but primarily this has to do with lending into the shadow banking system and reliance upon funding from the interbank market, where once other traders in the market and other banks think that the solvency of a particular financial institution is less secure, once one default becomes possible, many more become possible as well, and you'll have sort of a differentiation of credit based on how strong the local government is backing those banks, something we've sort of labeled as geographic counterparty risk, but also the fact that many of the depositors or the investors in wealth management products for the troubled financial institutions have themselves faced financial difficulties. So this is where we're seeing a lot of this pressure build within smaller financial institutions, and we would expect it to continue. The problem was that virtually every banking institution in China was perceived to be guaranteed. Well, if you think that ultimately moral hazard prevails and virtually everything bears implicit or explicit guarantees, then any introduction of new credit risk, any introduction of the possibility of default naturally sends the market scrambling for, okay, how far is that going to extend? How far do I need to be concerned about these risks? And what other institutions might face defaults? So ever since there was a haircut on interbank and corporate deposits in Baoshang Bank, for example, we've seen a level of different credit risk across the interbank markets in China and differentiation of lending standards across the interbank markets that we haven't seen before. And that has continued as more and more local governments have defaulted on, for example, corporate acceptances among LGFVs. You've seen local governments like Yongcheng Coal in the Hunan provincial government basically shifting resources away from bond repayments toward other obligations, which has caused defaults on local SOEs. So there's a lot of pressure, financial pressure like that is building. It always makes sense in a banking crisis to describe every individual failure as a one-off until everyone's aware that the problem is so widespread that you basically need to start imposing new rules and regulations on who's going to bear the losses in order to insulate the government from the broader fallout. I think we're very close to that scenario, that time frame right now in China, where PBOC and the Financial Stability and Development Committee are going to need to start talking about explicit loss-sharing mechanisms and how to restructure defaulted financial institutions, because it's fine to keep bailing these out incrementally up to a point. But after everyone realizes that ultimately the government's going to be on the hook for most of these bailouts, the contingent liabilities become too large. And that's when you start looking toward other forms of support from shareholders, from depositors, from investors, or so-called bail-ins to see that transition occur. There were hints of this in the Hunan rural bank failures earlier this year, where the PBOC and the local financial institutions, there were protests outside the local, I believe it was the PBOC office, it might have been the CBIRC office, that occurred in that province. And basically the regulators started from a position of, you're not bank depositors, you're investors in financial products. And those that were protesting basically argued that there was no difference, that the banks were offering these products and we were not made aware of the risks. And ultimately they did win some concessions for those products themselves. But that shows the transition that China is about to embark upon, which is from basically seeking external sources of finance to resolve some of these financial difficulties from the government, from the central bank, to trying to shift some of these obligations toward bail-ins or depositors or creditors or investors. Because ultimately, if the system is that large, that's sort of what you'll have to do to try to preserve some credibility of the government's capacity to intervene.
Obviously, you watch the Chinese financial markets very closely. So what are some of the other red flags that you might be seeing at the moment?
The property market slowdown has been a major adjustment that is still underappreciated just how significant it is. There's still this widespread assumption that Beijing has a lot of capacity to turn this around, and it's just not the case. So I'm continuing to watch, I think, for the property market's fallout within the financial system itself, because we simply have not seen a lot of the losses that were accumulating from what we calculate is about 10 to 11 trillion dollars in lending to the property sector in aggregate. We haven't seen a lot of the losses of that loan book and informal and formal loan book have an impact on the financial system so far. So that's one thing we're really watching for. The other sign we're really watching for is local government financing vehicles defaulting on their corporate bonds. This has been no local government financing vehicle has defaulted on a corporate bond so far. And yet, at the same time, the fundamentals, local government financing vehicles are clearly deteriorating. Localities are losing land sales revenues because of the fallout in the property sector, and their debt levels continue to rise. And their operating cash flows, they're not really designed to generate operating cash flows. They depend upon financing cash flows. So if all of a sudden you cut off local government financing vehicles from new finance, you have big problems in terms of being able to sustain Beijing's fiscal policy. So we're very much watching for that, for additional financial pressure coming from the property market fallout as well. The other thing to watch, I think, is what does the Chinese consumer do this year? How strong a rebound in consumption is there going to be? Certainly, there's going to be a rebound relative to the easing of COVID restrictions that we've seen, given the harsh nature of those restrictions over the last year. But I think it's a bit aspirational to assume that consumption is going to surge above its pre-pandemic trends, because there's considerable impact on employment, household incomes, and it'll take time for that to restore that kind of job growth within the economy. And it's far from certain that succeeds without pretty aggressive government policies to support household consumption. So we're very much watching for trends along those lines to see how the recovery gains momentum over the course of 2023, and if and when it starts to lose momentum later in the year.
So it appears there are fundamental cracks in the Chinese economy. And whilst these local governments can still point to their books and brag about fiscal responsibility, they're finding it harder and harder to hide the massive monetary anchors that they've placed around their necks, these over-leveraged LGFVs. And as the interest payments keep rising and more banks keep defaulting, this issue is only going to get worse and the clock will keep ticking. So how will Beijing tackle the issue? Who will Beijing designate the winners and losers? And when all of this bursts out into the open economy, does this mean the end of money-losing but influence-gaining long-term projects like the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, to answer that, we'll turn to our final guest.
Part 3, an all-in bet on skyrocketing debt.
Well, first of all, no government gets policy perfect, but I think there's some recent trends in China to strongly favor state enterprises and clamp down on some parts of the private sector, and it's become a somewhat more inward-focused economy. So there are some factors they can't change, like their demographics, and then there are some policy choices on top of that are tending to suppress the growth rate.
David Dollar is a senior fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, and the host of the Brookings trade podcast, Dollar and Cents. He's a leading expert on China's economy and US-China economic relations. From 2009 to 2013, Dollar was the US Treasury's economic and financial emissary to China, based in Beijing, facilitating the macroeconomic and financial policy dialogue between the United States and China. Prior to joining the Treasury, Dollar worked for 20 years for the World Bank, serving as the country's director for China and Mongolia, also based in Beijing. His other World Bank assignments focused on Asian economies, including South Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Bangladesh, and India. And David is well known for his work in the research department of the World Bank. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Well, they've got a number of different measures they're trying to apply, and I think some of them are sensible. That phrase, common prosperity's not really clearly defined, but I think the idea of making sure that everybody's lives are improving, that everybody's involved, that's basically sensible. That's the foundation of social democracy, really. So I think that makes positive sense. On the other hand, some of the things they're doing, cracking down on the digital economy, essentially big private firms in the internet business or on platforms, That's going to discourage entrepreneurship. So they've got, I think, some choices that are helping them, and then they've got some policies that are more political in a sense that are suppressing the economy.
Well, the big tech company everyone's speculating crackdowns on is WeChat. And for people who haven't been to China, WeChat is kind of a Chinese super app that almost every single person uses, which kind of combines Facebook, Uber, Amazon, games, WhatsApp, and many more. But quite importantly, it also combines your banking. The idea being that you can pretty much run your entire life from WeChat. And when you're there in China, you'll see that almost everybody pays for everything using WeChat. And whilst keeping payments centralized is good in some ways, because there's so much back and forth in between private citizens, it becomes really difficult to work out monetary amounts for tax purposes. So through a combination of WeChat, a still highly cash-driven society, and a lot of black and grey market trade between people, citizens above and below the table taxable income are two very different things, with citizens only declaring to the government a small fraction of what they probably actually make. And because of this, there are some suggesting that currently as little as only 2% of Chinese citizens actually pay income tax under this system. But with Beijing in desperate need of revenue, do you think they'll look to crack down on WeChat? Or does Beijing want to avoid risking people leaving the app, as the app's managers work very closely with Chinese authorities and Chinese intelligence services? And having all your citizens on the same app can be quite useful at times.
I think they've made an effort to collect more taxes from wealthy people in China, but I think in practice, the actual tax rate for high income people is pretty low. So I think they're more likely to try to really introduce property tax, capital gains tax, these things that hit capital, which they really do not have. That's something that's missing from their macroeconomic policies. I could see them trying to change that. It's hard to interfere with the digital economy, the basic aspect of paying with your phone aspect of the digital economy. I don't see them tinkering with that because it's such a foundation of people's lives in China now.
So why haven't they rolled out this property tax yet?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Michael. I think that the government has been talking about a property tax for a long time. It was part of Xi Jinping's agenda. And it's interesting that they haven't really moved on that. So I think it's not just the wealthy. I think there's a lot of middle-class resistance. I think 85% of the urban population owns at least one apartment, the one they live in. So in that kind of situation, people feel that they've worked hard, they've paid for the apartment. Many of them are carrying mortgages, so they're continuing to pay. And the basic idea that the government's now going to come in and tax that, it's really unpopular. And even though it's an authoritarian country, I think the leadership does pay attention to popular opinion. So they have resisted putting that property tax in place. But I think it's just such an essential foundation of taxation in a modern economy. I think they'll have to get there eventually.
If Beijing was to crack down on the property market, though, the middle class are likely to be one of the largest complainants, as properties become the main store of value to these groups, with the stock market not being seen as a safe option for Chinese investors. How do you think Beijing plans to get around this issue?
Right. So I think their policies toward real estate have created a classic bubble. It starts with some serious problems in their capital markets, the stock and bond markets. It's difficult for private firms to issue stocks and bonds. State enterprises dominate a lot of those markets. People don't have confidence in that. Stock market seems like something that the government controls. So Chinese households have put most of their private wealth in real estate. Something like 60 to 70% of their private wealth is in real estate, which is unusually high. And as that was developing, real estate prices were naturally going up. And so an additional factor is people thought you can't lose in real estate. And so a lot of the more recent investment in real estate has really been speculative, and prices went up in bubble fashion. And you can't predict when a bubble's going to pop, but sooner or later it's going to pop. You know, it's a reflection of the fact that they've built a lot more housing than they actually need. So now we're in a period where prices are going down, real estate activities declined, and that'll turn around eventually because even with a stable population, China needs more housing in certain places, needs bigger housing as people get wealthier. but they've got a lot of mismatch at the moment between where they build housing and where they need it. And that kind of correction is painful and can take some years.
Well, what happens if Beijing tries to adopt an American model in their stock exchange, remove the government controls and functions, and effectively let the free market decide the value of stocks, therefore making it more appealing to the average investor as a store of value? Do you think that would solve the problems, or frankly create a whole nother set of problems?
It would take time to get into the habit of ordinary people putting money into the stock market. And most ordinary people in a country like the United States, if they own stocks, it's through some kind of retirement account. So you'd also need to see the development of that kind of financial service in China. As it is, people rely to a large extent on the public pension. If they develop private pensions, private wealth management, you'd start getting financial firms investing large amounts of money. So I think it would take time to develop the capital markets. Basically, the Chinese and the U.S. economy, they're not that different in size. At this point, the U.S. is modestly larger than the Chinese economy, but the U.S. capital market is several times larger than the Chinese capital markets. I'm talking stocks and bond market capitalization. And that's just an example that China's pretty far behind in terms of developing those markets.
The project, which aimed to rapidly bolster the Chinese middle and consumer class to the point where China would sell the majority of the stuff they produce to its own people rather than export it around the world, creating much more self-reliance within the Chinese economy. This project was meant to be completed by 2025, but at the current trend, it seems like they'll get nowhere near its set goals. So why didn't this plan work here for China?
Well, I think it's interesting that, we went through a period where China was definitely less dependent on exports, seemed to be relying more on domestic demand. But in the last few years, that's definitely reversed. That's one probably unfortunate effect of the COVID pandemic, is China's exports have really surged. A lot of the rest of the world is demanding the things that China's good at making. People like myself, I'm mostly working from home. So I had to order a high quality microphone. I got a nice new laptop. We got a new TV. Most of this stuff is actually made in China. So Chinese exports have really soared in the last few years. That's a good example that, the government can plan various things, but then these shocks come along that are completely unpredictable. I think as the pandemic winds down, we'll probably see a reemergence of that trend for exports to be less important for China. It's kind of a natural development as you get into middle income and upper middle income.
When it comes to that decision, though, surely you're going to have, on one side, the foreign policy eyes suggesting that Beijing should keep their exports artificially cheap and keep most of Asia reliant on Chinese goods. As the more reliant they are on China, the more likely they are to side with Chinese foreign policy decisions. But on the other side, you have the economics guys who are going to tell them to raise the prices and focus on building domestic markets. But at those prices, investors are likely to find China too expensive and likely move parts of their manufacturing and supply chain off to Vietnam or India or somewhere else. So how does Beijing plan to square that?
The evidence of the last few years is, despite rhetoric, China is becoming a more open economy in terms of trade and also in terms of direct investment. So you do see burgeoning trade and investment between China and ASEAN, for example, the countries of Southeast Asia. That's becoming a more important partner. South Korea, Japan, as you say, are key partners. That trade is on the rise. So there's a modest tendency for China, for more of China's trade to be with its Asian partners. I think that's an interesting development, partly reflecting that a lot of Asia is growing well, so it's natural for there to be more trade, but part of it's political. The U.S. is confused about the extent to which it wants to decouple from China, but you certainly see some reduction in trade and investment between U.S. and China in a few key sectors. Not overall. The U.S. is actually going to import more from China in 2022, did import more in 2022 than ever before, and the U.S. exported more than ever before. So trade between the US and China is actually going to hit a new high. But from China's point of view, it's rising even more rapidly in its relations with Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea. Europe, to some extent, though Europe is slowing down very dramatically now, so that trend will probably change.
One of the major strengths of the US financial system is the fact that the US dollar is effectively the world's reserve currency, and because of which most debts and most agreements are done in US dollars, even if the agreement doesn't involve the US in any manner whatsoever. And most importantly, almost all oil and gas is traded in US dollars, giving everyone an incentive to keep that currency stable. When you go to certain places on the internet, though, there's always talk of China looking to try and dent the strength of the US by bucking this trend and agreeing to trade oil in yuan, whilst also encouraging other friendly nations with Beijing to do the same. In your educated opinion, though, do you think Beijing would actually ever attempt this? And if so, do you think the US dollar has anything to fear?
I think my namesake, the US dollar's in pretty good shape. I think its dominant share of world reserves is well entrenched. And it depends on things like good property rights and rule of law in the United States, deep capital markets. If you're holding US dollar assets, those are deep markets in which you can trade them if you need to exchange for something else. The problem with, say, the yuan becoming an important reserve currency is, if you're an agent in some other country, a firm, you don't particularly want to hold Chinese renminbi as a reserve. If there's a crisis, you don't know how easy it's going to be to exchange it. Or while you're holding it, we already talked about the problems in Chinese capital markets. So if China wants to become a serious reserve currency, they need a lot of reform in terms of property rights and capital markets. And then creating something new and different. It'd be hard to see how that would really take off. It would have to be backed strongly by China, I think, to have any credibility. And then you get into exactly the same problems that China lacks rule of law, deep capital markets, and it's just not a place where international firms are going to want to put a lot of their resources.
When Russia invaded the rest of Ukraine back in 2022, they had pretty severe sanctions placed on them almost immediately by most of the world's major economies. I'm sure China watched the global response there very closely, and it's time to think what they would do under similar circumstances. So if the rumors you always see are to be believed, and China does carry out its attempt at an invasion of Taiwan in 2027, and we do see the world respond with a similar level of sanctions, do you think the Chinese economy would be robust enough by that point to absorb sanctions at that level? Can trade with Russia or the Middle East or Central Asia really replace the amount of trade they do on a daily basis with ASEAN or Western economies?
Well, one thing I want to add in here, Michael, is there's huge uncertainty about these topics we're talking about. So, my instinct is that the globalization matters more to us, to everybody, than is generally realized. It's just something people take for granted, that we have this relatively smooth trade among countries and lots of cross-border investment. And my instinct is this is really the foundation of everybody's prosperity, but even more so for a developing country like China compared to, say, the United States. So I think decoupling would be a big shock to the United States, but it would be an even bigger shock to China. So what a lot of their middle-class people are used to, traveling around, certain types of goods and services that they buy. Many of the elites in China maintain financial accounts abroad. They're used to using international financial services to manage their wealth. All of that's going to become much, much more difficult, if not impossible. So I think it would be a really serious dent in living standards for people both in advanced economies like Australia and in China. China benefits enormously from the current parameters of globalization, the trade, the rules. So the end of that would be a huge shock to the Chinese economy. China is very dependent on the external economy, essentially for two things as I see it. One is natural resources. China is energy scarce, food scarce in certain metals like iron and copper, for example. So breakdown in globalization would really hurt them on that front. And then probably more importantly, they're dependent on the external market for technology. So real decoupling between the advanced economies in China would definitely set China back very seriously. Now, it might inspire their effort to develop indigenous technology, but that's not gone particularly well up till now. And I don't think cutting yourself off from the world market is a good strategy for technology development. And for all these reasons, China is very unlikely to invade Taiwan, as I said, in the next few years. Taiwan would have to declare independence, I think. Then China would probably do something militarily. But the leadership and the people of Taiwan know that. If you look at Taiwan opinion polls, people want to stick with the status quo for an indefinite time, as far as I can see. So if everybody would just stay calm and accept this status quo, then I think we can avoid these sanctions and military risks that we're talking about.
There's a lot of people worried in the US at the moment about the upcoming fractures in the Chinese economy and how closely it's tied to the US economy. Worried that if China goes down, it may take a lot of the world economy with it. So short of war, what methods could a US president use to begin decoupling or at least building a degree of separation between the Chinese and American economies?
Up till now, the US has, in practice, walked a pretty fine line. It's got some pretty serious technology controls on export of semiconductors and machinery to make semiconductors. And it's put firms like Huawei on our entity list, limiting the trade and investment. But that's a pretty small share of U.S. trade with China. So at the moment, most of the trade with China is continuing. And there continues to be a lot of U.S. investment into China, U.S. multinationals. Big drop in Chinese investment into the U.S. So that's been the most visible aspect of this decoupling. But I think the U.S. has walked a fine line, and the issue in 2023 and beyond is, does the U.S. ramp that up? Does a new Republican House succeed in introducing a lot more restrictions on ordinary trade and investment between the U.S. and China? I think that would be a serious negative for China and a moderate negative for the United States from a purely economic point of view.
Well, with China facing these real estate crises and these banking crises and credit crunches, where do you see the Chinese economy by, let's say, 2027?
And the prediction that the Chinese economy eventually overtakes the U.S. in terms of nominal GDP, that still strikes me as a pretty sensible projection because China has 4 times as many people. Their trend growth rate is definitely slowing down. I think if they can grow at 5 over the next few years, that would be really excellent. And I don't expect them to do that well. I think for the next few years, we may be seeing more in the 4 to 5 range. And that's a combination of lots of positives they still have and the fact that they still have catch-up potential. But on the other hand, they've got some statist policies that tend to slow growth down. But over the time period you're talking about, we'll probably continue to see the Chinese growth rate slow down. But remember, the advanced economy like the U.S., trend growth rate is something like 1.7. So if China is growing even at 3, it will eventually overtake the U.S. in terms of nominal GDP. So I think that is the likely scenario, that we won't get a strikingly high number out of China anymore, but it will gradually catch up in total size. But again, the fact that it's got 4 times as many people, that's pretty key to this whole calculation.
So that's where we're at. China, the world's economic engine, may seem clean on the surface, but as the LGFVs tell us, it can be pretty messy underneath. And I'm sure that many of you, maybe even a little older than me, listened to this piece and heard many of these same warning signs and red flags present within the US economy right before the GFC. And you might be right. There are numerous economists at the moment who are watching the Chinese housing market tumble down the exact same road, hoping that instead of befalling the same fate as the US in 2008, the Beijing steps in and deflates the market of their own accord, rather than just letting it pop. But voluntarily deflating your economy, though, is like ordering a recession upon the country. One at this particular point in history may permanently scare away investors, or even cause the middle class to demand more concessions. After all, these anti-COVID protests seem to have worked, and the population might be realizing that protests do get concessions. As Xi, you're also probably aware that by him pushing the button and ordering the recession, even if it needed to be done, will give other members of the party something they can blame on Xi. And Xi may worry about future whispers within the party halls, touting the downturn as not a real estate adjustment, but a Xi recession. And for Xi, a man who has proven himself to value power and centralization within the party, that may be terrifying. So Xi knows that this lever has to be pulled, but the timing to take on this economic medicine and begin deflating the bubble has to be picked with maximum care. The trouble there, though, is that Xi may be waiting for the perfect time to begin these policies, but I don't think there'll ever be a perfect time for it. And the longer you wait, the more chance the bubble just pops on its own. And the roadmaps, timeframes, response programs, and everything else that Xi could roll out to lessen the blow will now have its timing driven by the markets rather than by Beijing. So, if you were standing over those economic sliders, what would be your policy? Would you pop the real estate bubble and causing a massive slowdown in China and almost inevitably hurting global trade? All of which to fix the shortcuts of a number of state bureaucrats who are just trying to make a name for themselves in Chinese politics. Would you pop the bubble? Unfortunately for Xi and his continuing centralization of the party, that decision seems to be resting solely with him now, and with it the chance for glory, but more likely the inevitable blame that comes with it, deserved or not. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. It's always interesting to do these more economics-driven episodes, and when it comes to China, I really feel like we only just scrape the surface here, but we don't have infinite time. We do have lots more episodes though, so I'm sure we'll be returning to this topic at some point in the near future. But if you want to know exactly when we're returning to that topic, you can keep up to date with all of our upcoming contents and everything else we've got going on by either visiting the Redline website or by checking out all of the links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle at the Redline Pod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle at MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. As most of you know, this show is completely funded by our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each week to help myself and the team keep this going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Aljirim Burbekbayeva, who is the latest Patreon to sign up as of time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like Aljirim, who donate a small amount of money each month to help us keep the show going. So if you like what we do here at the show, and you feel like you have a couple dollars you could spare a month, we greatly appreciate it. But for now, Aljirim, this episode on the Chinese economy is all thanks to you. Cheers. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is China Unbound by this week's guest, Joanna Chiu, for an economic, political, and cultural look at the current state of China, hitting a lot of the angles often missed in this conversation. The second is China, The Bubble That Never Pops by Thomas Orlick, for a closer look at the Chinese real estate market. And the third is Superpower China, for a look at the history, politics, education, economy, and military of the Chinese state. It's a really good crash course. I also want to say thanks to this week's guests, Joanna Chiu, Logan Wright, and David Dollar. These 3 are some of my favorite analysts when it comes to Chinese macroeconomics, and it was great to have them on this week. I also want to give a big thanks to my staff, Wade McCarr, the producer, Perry Grace, Daniel Zivella, Genevieve Donald-May, Nate Ostilla, Nick McNally, Sean Cotter-Lem, Isaac Gibbs, Ahmad Al-Ahmad, Andrew Garbery, and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanner, our media director, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Derek Henry Flood, our deputy editor, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Ross Crabtree, our media advisor, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. This entire team is very busy producing some of the best content I think we ever put together, and I can't wait to show it to you guys. So, the Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed on this episode are solely those of our guests, Michael and the Redline Podcast. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.